The moment a stranger called me by my real name, I knew my perfect lie was over. For 43 days, I had lived on a cracked concrete sidewalk 3 blocks from Lexington Avenue, wearing torn layers that smelled of rain and dust, while the most powerful crime family in New York believed their boss had disappeared into private negotiations overseas. The newspapers speculated. Rival families celebrated too early. My own captains followed the false trail exactly as I had planned. Every lie had a purpose. Every rumor was bait. I wasn't searching for sympathy. I was hunting the one man inside my organization who had been selling pieces of my empire one secret at a time. Only a mafia boss could afford to vanish without surrendering control, because every move I made from the shadows still reached every corner of the city before sunrise. My name was Adrian Moretti, and even dressed as a beggar, I still ruled this city. Most people never looked at me. Some crossed the street. Others dropped loose change into the paper cup beside my boot without meeting my eyes. Fear and wealth create the same blindness. They stop people from seeing another human being. Then she appeared. She walked the same route every morning just after 8, carrying insulated food containers from the neighborhood shelter. She wasn't dressed like someone chasing success. Simple jeans, a navy jacket, comfortable sneakers, brown blonde hair tied back, green eyes that noticed everything. On the first morning, she handed me a warm bowl of soup. On the second, she remembered I preferred black coffee. By the end of the week, she brought an extra sandwich because she claimed I looked thinner than before. She never asked for my story. She never offered pity. She simply treated me like I still mattered. That was rarer than loyalty in my world. My security team watched from unmarked vehicles half a block away, rotating every few hours so no pattern could be detected. They never approached unless I ordered it. They knew the rules. If my disguise survived, the traitor would eventually expose himself. If anyone interfered, 43 days would become meaningless. Evelyn Brooks unknowingly became the only variable I couldn't predict. Every conversation with her lasted only a few minutes. Yet somehow she left me questioning people I had trusted for years. She talked about kindness as if it were practical instead of naive. She laughed easily but observed quietly. Once she noticed the expensive watch tan line hidden beneath the dirt on my wrist. Another day she stared at my hands before smiling to herself. I caught that smile. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition. On the 43rd morning, she placed a cup of coffee beside me, folded her arms, and spoke so softly that passing strangers never even turned their heads. "You hide being poor better than anyone I've ever met," she said. "But men who command rooms don't forget how to stand. Not even when they're pretending." My heartbeat stayed perfectly steady. Years of negotiations had taught me never to react before understanding the board. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," I answered. She smiled again, almost kindly. "No, Mr. Moretti. I think everyone else has." Then she walked away before I could ask a single question. I waited exactly 30 seconds before touching the hidden earpiece beneath my collar. "Report." My chief of security answered immediately. "Boss, we have a problem. Someone started following Ms. Brooks 20 minutes ago." The silver sedan stayed exactly 4 car lengths behind Evelyn until she reached the community kitchen on East 53rd Street. My surveillance team sent every update through encrypted audio while I remained seated on the same weathered blanket outside the subway entrance, looking like a man who had nowhere else to go. The sedan never parked. It circled the block twice before disappearing into morning traffic. That alone told me enough. Professionals observed. Amateurs stared. Whoever had assigned that vehicle understood patience, and patience usually belonged to people who had resources. I lowered my head and stirred the untouched coffee Evelyn had left beside me. For the first time since this operation began, the mission had shifted. I was no longer simply hunting a traitor inside my organization. Someone had connected my disguise to an innocent woman, and that meant the game had accelerated without my permission. By noon, I quietly left the sidewalk through a service alley where a delivery van waited with fresh clothes and a secure communications case. 5 minutes later, I sat inside the back compartment wearing an ordinary gray jacket instead of torn layers, while 6 digital files appeared across the screen in front of me. Every record belonged to Evelyn Brooks. Birth certificate, employment history, tax returns, volunteer records. Nothing unusual until the timeline reached her 18th birthday. Then everything simply stopped. There were no school transcripts before that year. No pediatric medical records. No photographs. No online footprint. It was as though someone had erased the first half of her life with surgical precision. I looked at Marco, my intelligence chief. Who cleans records this thoroughly? He hesitated before answering. Government agencies. Or someone with enough money to buy silence everywhere. I leaned back without saying another word. Evelyn had claimed she worked in a neighborhood kitchen because people deserved warm meals regardless of their circumstances. That sounded simple. Too simple. People with hidden pasts often built quiet lives for one reason. They were hiding from someone. I returned to the sidewalk before she finished work. Routine mattered. If anyone watched me, they needed to believe nothing had changed. At 6:15, she appeared carrying 2 paper bags instead of 1. I figured you skipped lunch, she said as she handed one to me. I smiled faintly. You seem unusually confident for someone speaking to a stranger every day. She shrugged. People tell you who they are without realizing it. I opened the bag and found homemade chicken soup with fresh bread. Then tell me who I am, I said carefully. She looked directly into my eyes, and for a moment the noise of traffic seemed to disappear. You notice every reflection in every window before you cross the street. You always sit where you can watch every exit. You never eat until everyone around you has walked away. Your shoes are worn on purpose, but your posture is not. Poor people protect what they have. Powerful people protect everyone around them. That is the difference. I almost laughed because every observation was correct. And yet you still brought me dinner. She nodded. Because whatever you are pretending to be, I have never seen you pretend to be cruel. Before I could respond, my hidden earpiece crackled with quiet urgency. Boss, Marco whispered, we found the sedan. It belongs to a logistics company that does not actually exist. And there is something else. A second surveillance team just arrived. They are not watching you anymore. They are watching Evelyn. I did not wait for my enemies to make the next move because hesitation was how empires collapsed. By sunrise, every camera within 6 blocks of the community kitchen had been quietly mirrored into my private network. Every delivery truck, every rideshare, every unfamiliar face passed through my analysts before they reached the next intersection. I remained invisible on the sidewalk while my organization moved beneath the city like clockwork. That was the advantage of leading an empire instead of reacting to one. Around 9 o'clock, Marco's voice reached my earpiece. Boss, we identified one member of the surveillance team. Former private security, hired through 3 shell companies. Whoever is paying them does not want to leave fingerprints. I watched pedestrians hurry toward work as though nothing unusual existed beyond their own schedules. Follow the money, I said quietly. Not the people. Less than an hour later, another message arrived. There is a payment trail leading towards someone inside our distribution network. I felt my jaw tighten. That was impossible unless the leak had survived every internal audit I ordered during the past year. The traitor had not disappeared. He had simply become more patient. At noon, Evelyn stepped outside, carrying 2 bags of groceries. She waved at an elderly man pushing an empty shopping cart before noticing me across the street. You look like you barely slept, she said after sitting beside me on the curb. I smiled without answering. She studied my face for a moment before speaking again. You have been watching reflections all morning instead of people. I looked at her carefully. You notice more than most. She laughed softly. No, I just pay attention when something feels different. She handed me a bottle of water and pointed toward the opposite corner. The man pretending to read the newspaper has not turned a page in 15 minutes. Without moving my head, I caught the reflection in a storefront window. She was right. The observer was new. Not one of my men. Not one of yesterday's watchers either. Whoever directed this operation was changing personnel to avoid patterns. Evelyn stood to leave, then suddenly stopped. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. If you had all the power in the world, would you trust anyone enough to tell them the truth? The question landed harder than any accusation. Before I could answer, she smiled almost sadly. Never mind. Sometimes people wear disguises because they are hiding from danger. Sometimes they wear them because they are hiding from themselves. She walked away before I found the right words. Marco interrupted the silence. Boss, we intercepted a secure message between the surveillance teams. Read it. He hesitated. The instruction says, do not approach the target until confirmation arrives. The woman must remain alive. She remembers something she does not know she remembers. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That sentence changed everything. Evelyn was never the target because of me. She had always been the target. I rose from the sidewalk for the first time that day. "Prepare the car," I ordered. "The disguise ends now." Within minutes, a black sedan stopped beside the alley behind the shelter. I climbed inside, exchanged the worn coat for a tailored charcoal suit, fastened the silver Moretti family ring back onto my hand, and watched my reflection return. The beggar disappeared. The Mafia Boss remained. Before the car reached the next traffic light, Marco looked up from his tablet, his face unusually pale. "Boss," he said carefully, "we finally identified the person who authorized the surveillance. The access code belongs to one of our own capos." The conference room on the 42nd floor overlooked the entire Manhattan skyline, but I never looked out the windows during meetings. Cities changed. Faces lied. Numbers rarely did. Marco placed a thin black folder in front of me without speaking. Inside was a personnel file belonging to Vincent DeLuca, one of my oldest capos. 23 years inside the Moretti organization. Flawless financial reports. Perfect attendance at every family meeting. Absolute loyalty, at least on paper. Then Marco slid a second page across the table. A series of encrypted transactions connected 3 shell corporations to the same logistics company that had been tracking Evelyn. Every transfer had been authorized using Vincent's private security credentials. I stared at the pages for several silent seconds before closing the folder. "Keep watching him," I said calmly. "If he betrayed us once, he will believe he can do it again." Nobody questioned the order. That was the difference between authority and fear. Fear demanded attention. Authority earned obedience before a word was spoken. 2 hours later, I changed back into ordinary clothes, left the tower through a private garage, and returned to the neighborhood where Evelyn spent every afternoon serving meals. She spotted me almost immediately. "I was wondering if you disappeared for good," she said with an amused smile. "I had something to take care of," I replied. "Everyone does," she answered as she handed me a paper cup of hot chili. "The question is whether it changes who they are." We sat in comfortable silence while the evening crowd drifted past us. Finally, I asked the question that had been echoing in my mind since the day we met. "How did you know who I really was?" She looked down at the cup in her hands before meeting my eyes again. "Because I grew up around people who believed power was something you wore. You wear yours differently. You have never met me before." "No," she admitted. "But confidence leaves fingerprints just like fear does." I almost smiled. "That sounds like experience." Her expression softened. "Maybe it is." Before I could press further, a young volunteer called her name from inside the kitchen. She excused herself, disappearing through the back entrance. The moment she was gone, my secure phone vibrated once. Marco never called unless something mattered. "Talk." His voice was unusually tense. "Boss, we recovered an archived municipal database. Evelyn Brooks was never supposed to exist under that name." I stood without realizing it. "Explain." "There is an older file from 15 years ago. Same face, different name, different birth date, different parents." My pulse remained steady, but every instinct sharpened. "Send it." The document appeared on my screen seconds later. The photograph showed a frightened little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. Underneath it, one line froze my thoughts more effectively than any threat ever could. Status: deceased. Official date of death: October 14th, 15 years earlier. Yet I had spoken with her every day for 6 weeks. Before I could process the contradiction, another encrypted message flashed across my phone. It came from one of my surveillance teams stationed near the shelter. "Boss, Ms. Brooks just received an anonymous envelope." She looked inside for only a second, then turned completely pale. "She is leaving on foot instead of taking her usual route. Should we intervene?" I looked across the street just in time to see Evelyn clutch the envelope tightly against her jacket. She stopped beneath a traffic light, slowly opened it again, and whispered 4 words that none of my men could hear, but my directional microphone captured with perfect clarity. "How are you alive, Dad?" My instincts told me to order my men to surround Evelyn immediately, but instincts without evidence had destroyed smarter men than me. I chose patience. Patience had built my empire. Through the tinted window of my sedan, I watched her leave the intersection with the anonymous envelope still trembling in her hand. She did not notice the discreet security detail shadowing her from a distance. She did not know that every traffic camera along her route now streamed directly into my operations center. "No contact," I told Marco. "If she believes someone is watching her, Whoever sent that envelope wins. He nodded. What about Vincent? I looked at the city passing outside the window. Bring him to tomorrow's executive meeting exactly as scheduled. If he thinks I suspect him, he disappears. If he believes I know nothing, he makes another mistake. Less than an hour later, I entered Moretti Tower through the private elevator reserved for family leadership. The executive conference room fell silent the moment I walked in. Vincent DeLuca stood beside the long walnut table, smiling with the same calm confidence I had trusted for years. He greeted me exactly as he always had. Good evening, boss. I returned the greeting without revealing a single thought. How is the Brooklyn operation? He answered smoothly, offering shipment numbers, financial projections, and routine updates that would have convinced anyone else. While he spoke, I watched his eyes instead of his reports. Every experienced liar eventually glanced toward the one thing he feared most. Vincent looked only once toward the empty chair usually occupied by my intelligence director. One glance. Less than a second. It was enough. He knew Marco was investigating something. After the meeting ended, I remained alone with Marco in the conference room. He placed another folder before me. We searched the abandoned records warehouse connected to Evelyn's original identity, he said quietly. Most files were destroyed years ago. One survived because it had been misplaced inside an unrelated archive. Inside was a faded photograph of a middle-aged accountant standing beside several locked filing cabinets. The man's name read Daniel Carter. My eyes narrowed. That is not Brooks. Marco shook his head. No, we believe Brooks was assigned later. Daniel Carter disappeared 15 years ago, the same week his daughter was officially declared dead. His daughter, I repeated slowly. You believe Evelyn is Daniel Carter's child? We do. I stared at the old photograph. Daniel looked ordinary. A man no one would notice twice. Yet someone had erased his family so completely that even government databases accepted the fiction. Ordinary men were never erased without extraordinary reasons. Before I could respond, one of my encrypted phones vibrated with a priority alert reserved only for active surveillance. Marco answered first, his expression changing instantly. Boss, Evelyn just entered St. Andrew's Church. Alone? Yes. Who followed her? No one. But someone was already waiting inside. Every muscle in my body tightened. Identity. Marco enlarged a still image captured from a nearby security camera. The elderly man wore a simple gray coat and carried a worn leather briefcase. His face triggered nothing in my memory until Marco zoomed in on a small silver lapel pin shaped like a compass. My father had given identical pins to only 5 civilians during his lifetime. Men he trusted more than politicians, bankers, or judges. I had met every one of them except a single name buried deep inside forgotten family records. Marco looked at me in disbelief. Boss, the man inside the church is Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter did not embrace his daughter. He did not even step close enough to touch her. Instead, he looked over both shoulders before placing the worn leather briefcase on a wooden church pew. Years of fear had taught him that survival depended on distance, not affection. My surveillance feed carried only the images, not the sound, but I did not need words to recognize the expression on Evelyn's face. Relief lasted barely a second before confusion replaced it. She wanted answers. He seemed determined to give her warnings instead. I remained inside my sedan 2 blocks away, watching through the secure live feed, while every available Moretti intelligence asset quietly sealed the surrounding streets without attracting attention. If Daniel Carter had stayed hidden for 15 years, he had not chosen today by coincidence. Someone had forced his hand. Boss, Marco said, studying another monitor. Vincent just canceled his dinner reservation and left Moretti Tower through the underground garage. I looked at him without speaking. He is heading toward the church. That confirmed everything. Vincent had not merely leaked information. He had anticipated Daniel's appearance. The trap had been prepared long before I discovered the surveillance teams. Keep every unit invisible, I ordered. No sirens. No panic. Nobody enters until I give the word. The convoy reached the church district in less than 6 minutes. I stepped out wearing the same charcoal suit that announced my authority long before anyone recognized my face. My men instinctively formed a respectful perimeter, but I waved them farther back. This meeting belonged to Evelyn before it belonged to me. Through the stained glass windows, I watched Daniel remove several aged documents from the briefcase. Evelyn stared at them as though each page erased another year of the life she believed she understood. Then Daniel reached into his coat and produced a small velvet pouch. He placed it gently into her hands. She opened it, and even through the camera, I recognized the object inside. It was an old silver ring engraved with the Moretti family crest, a design discontinued before I inherited the organization. My father had worn one almost identical in every photograph from my childhood. Marco turned toward me in disbelief. "Boss, how could Daniel have that?" "That," I answered quietly, "is exactly what I intend to learn." Before we could move closer, another encrypted report appeared on my tablet. One of our cyber analysts had finally broken into Vincent's private communication server. Hundreds of deleted messages flooded the screen. Financial records, secret meeting schedules, internal security maps. None of them surprised me. The final message did. It had been sent only 27 minutes earlier. "Find the accountant. Recover the ledger. Do not let Moretti discover what his father promised." I read the sentence twice. My father had been dead for 11 years, yet someone was still building plans around a promise he had made decades earlier. Inside the church, Daniel suddenly looked toward the entrance. His expression shifted from cautious hope to unmistakable alarm. He pushed the briefcase toward Evelyn instead of keeping it for himself. She resisted at first, but he insisted. At that exact moment, my earpiece crackled. "Boss," one of my spotters whispered, "Vincent's vehicle just stopped behind the church. He is not alone. And according to thermal imaging, someone inside Daniel's briefcase has activated a hidden tracking device." The tracker inside Daniel's briefcase did not frighten me. It answered a question I had been asking for weeks. Someone did not want the briefcase destroyed. They wanted it followed. "Do not touch it," I told Marco through my earpiece. "If they think the signal is still moving exactly as planned, they will expose everyone connected to it." He immediately relayed the order across our encrypted network. That was how wars were won in my world. Not by rushing into chaos, but by allowing impatient people to reveal themselves. Inside the church, Daniel carefully closed Evelyn's fingers around the velvet pouch. Even from a distance, I could see tears gathering in her eyes as he spoke. She shook her head several times, refusing to accept whatever truth he had hidden from her for 15 years. Then Daniel pointed toward the briefcase, toward the church doors, and finally toward the sky above the stained glass windows, as if reminding her that time had almost run out. My phone vibrated again. Another intelligence report. 3 separate vehicles had entered Lower Manhattan during the last 20 minutes using cloned license plates. None belonged to the Moretti organization. None belonged to Vincent's known associates either. A third player had entered the board without announcing itself. "Boss," Marco whispered, "we are also seeing unusual financial transfers between 2 rival families. They stopped fighting each other yesterday." I smiled without humor. "Because they finally found something worth cooperating over. The ledger." Whatever Daniel had protected all these years mattered enough to unite people who normally trusted no one. That made it more valuable than money. It made it dangerous. I stepped through the church doors before anyone else could. Evelyn turned first. The surprise in her eyes lasted only a heartbeat before recognition replaced it. She had already seen through every disguise I had worn. Daniel looked at me with an expression that felt strangely familiar, almost like relief. "Mr. Moretti," Evelyn said quietly, "I knew you would come." I looked at the briefcase before meeting her eyes. "You knew far more than that." She took a slow breath. "The day I met you on the sidewalk, I was not surprised because you were pretending to be poor. I was surprised because I recognized your family ring before you stopped wearing it." Every word landed with perfect precision. "You saw it on the first day?" I asked. She nodded. "Just for a second when you reached for the coffee cup. After that, I waited to see whether the man behind the ring matched the stories people told about the name." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as though a burden he had carried for decades had finally become too heavy. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded letter sealed with dark blue wax. The seal belonged to my late father. My heartbeat remained calm, but my hands felt unexpectedly heavy as I broke it open. There were only 2 sentences written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "If Daniel Carter ever finds his way back to our family, protect his daughter before you protect the empire." The ledger does not belong to the strongest man. It belongs to the only person who still remembers the truth. Before I could read another word, Every phone carried by my security team vibrated simultaneously with the same emergency alert. Marco looked up from his screen, his face completely drained of color. "Boss," he said, "Vincent is gone. And someone just accessed the private vault beneath Moretti Tower using your highest-level security authorization." The private vault beneath Moretti Tower had never been breached in 3 decades because it was protected by more than steel and technology. It was protected by certainty. Everyone inside my organization believed only I could open it. The emergency alert proved someone wanted me to question my own people before I questioned my enemies. I folded my father's letter, slipped it inside my jacket, and looked at Daniel. "The ledger never mattered by itself, did it?" He slowly shook his head. "The ledger is only a map. The truth people are willing to destroy each other for is hidden somewhere else." Evelyn stared at both of us, trying to assemble a lifetime of missing pieces. "Then why erase me?" she asked quietly. Daniel's shoulders dropped as though 15 years of guilt had finally become impossible to carry. "Because the safest witness is the one the world believes no longer exists." Silence settled inside the old church. It was not fear. It was the weight of answers arriving too late. I turned toward Marco. "Seal the vault, but do not arrest anyone yet." He frowned. "Boss, if Vincent is inside," I interrupted him. "If Vincent used my authorization, then someone wanted me to know immediately. Real thieves hide their tracks. Smart enemies leave exactly one trail because they expect you to follow it." Marco nodded without another question. He had worked beside me long enough to recognize when the battlefield had changed. We left the church together, but I insisted Evelyn and Daniel ride in separate vehicles. If someone had been watching them for weeks, I wanted every observer to wonder which car carried the briefcase. 3 identical black sedans departed in different directions, while the real briefcase remained inside a plane delivery van driven by one of my oldest intelligence officers. Halfway back to Manhattan, another report reached my phone. "Boss, the tracker inside the original briefcase has stopped moving." I smiled for the first time that day, because they found the decoy. Every route, every vehicle, every timing decision had been designed to force our opponents into revealing their surveillance network. Within minutes, my analysts identified nearly 24 dormant communication devices activating across the city at once. They were not speaking to Vincent. They were speaking to someone above him. Marco enlarged the network map until one blinking signal remained at its center. It originated less than 2 miles from Moretti Tower, inside a historic financial building that had once belonged to my father. I looked out the window as evening settled over Manhattan, the skyline glowing beneath a sky that had turned deep blue. My father had not left me an empire. He had left me a puzzle. Daniel leaned forward from the seat across from me and quietly placed one final photograph into my hand. It showed him standing beside my father more than 20 years earlier. Between them stood a little girl with brown blonde hair, smiling as she held the same stuffed rabbit I had seen in the archived file. My father rested one protective hand on her shoulder. On the back of the photograph, written in his careful handwriting, were 8 words that changed everything I believed about destiny. "Protect her until my son understands why she matters." I looked at Evelyn through the opposite window as she rode in the second vehicle, completely unaware that my father had planned for our lives to cross decades before either of us understood the reason. At that exact moment, Marco received the final intelligence update of the night, and his voice became almost a whisper. "Boss, the person commanding Vincent has agreed to meet in 1 hour. They believe you are walking into their trap. They have no idea you already know where they are waiting. An empire does not survive because its leader wins every battle. It survives because its leader recognizes the only battle that truly matters." I arrived at the abandoned financial building 10 minutes before the scheduled meeting, leaving every visible security vehicle 3 blocks away. My men disappeared into the city the way they had been trained for years, never announcing their presence, never creating panic. If tonight ended the way I expected, the Moretti family would never again wonder who had been selling pieces of our future. Marco stood beside me as the freight elevator climbed toward the executive floor that had once belonged to my father. "Boss," he said quietly, "every communication signal inside the building belongs to people we have already identified." I nodded. "Good. That means they have stopped hiding." When the elevator doors opened, Vincent DeLuca stood waiting in the center of the empty boardroom. He looked older than he had only hours earlier, not because of fear, but because secrets eventually become heavier than loyalty. You already know, he said calmly. Enough, I replied. Not everything. He smiled faintly and stepped aside. Another man emerged from the shadows, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades influencing powerful people without ever standing in front of them. Your father was a remarkable strategist, he said. He simply trusted the wrong people. Including you? I asked. He laughed softly. Especially me. The conversation that followed answered questions that had haunted 2 generations. The ledger had never contained financial accounts. It recorded promises, alliances, and sworn obligations between families who had chosen peace over endless revenge. My father had hidden it because he believed one day someone would attempt to replace cooperation with permanent conflict for profit. Vincent admitted he had not wanted power for himself. He had wanted control over the future by deciding which promises survived and which disappeared forever. You spent 43 days pretending to be powerless, he said. Did you learn anything useful? I thought of cold sidewalks, paper cups filled with coins, strangers who never looked down, and one woman who always did. Everything, I answered. Vincent slowly lowered his eyes. He knew the game had ended long before this meeting began. Outside, my organization quietly secured every remaining document connected to the conspiracy without chaos, without public attention, and without becoming the story itself. The city would wake tomorrow believing nothing extraordinary had happened. That was exactly how I preferred it. Hours later, I returned alone to the same sidewalk where my disguise had begun. The morning air carried the familiar smell of fresh coffee and rain on concrete. Evelyn arrived just after 8 with 2 paper cups in her hands. She smiled before sitting beside me. I wondered if you would ever come back here, she said. I needed to, I admitted. Why? I looked around at the people rushing toward another busy day, most of them too distracted to notice either of us. Because this is the only place where someone ever saw me before they saw my name. She laughed quietly and handed me one of the coffees. You know, she said, I never cared whether you were a mafia boss or a man wearing old clothes. Then what did you care about? She looked straight into my eyes, exactly as she had on the first morning. The first day we met, you thought nobody was watching. A veteran sat 2 benches away pretending to sleep. You quietly placed your own lunch beside him before eating anything yourself. No title can fake kindness when nobody is looking. For the first time in years, I had no clever answer. I simply sat beside her in comfortable silence while the city hurried past us. I still ruled New York from the shadows, and my family remained stronger than ever. But the greatest truth I uncovered during those 43 days was not hidden inside a vault, a ledger, or an old letter. It was sitting beside me with a paper cup of black coffee, reminding me that the only person who had ever truly defeated Adrian Moretti had done it without fear, without power, and without ever believing my greatest lie.